You're listening to the Transform Your Life from the Inside Out podcast. This episode is titled Life and Death. And in this episode, I want to dig a little deeper into the concepts of life and death, meaning a little deeper in that most people never really even think about the concepts of life and death and what it means to their own life and death. Keep listening.
Hi, I'm Jim Fortin, and you're about to start transforming your life from the inside out with this podcast. I'm widely considered the leader in subconscious transformation, and I've coached super achievers all around the world for over 25 years. Here, you're going to find no rah-rah motivation and no hype, because this podcast is a combination of brain science, transformational psychology, and ancient wisdom all rolled into one to take your life to levels you've never thought possible. If you're wanting a lot more in life, to feel better, to heal, to have peace of mind, to feel powerful and alive, and to bring more abundance and prosperity into your life, then this podcast is for you, because you're going to start learning how to master your mind and evolve your consciousness. And when you do that, anything you want then becomes possible for you. I'm glad you're here.
This episode applies to everyone. And I mean everyone, because I know some episodes apply more to some people than, others. But it applies to everyone because everyone listening is alive. I'm guessing you're alive. And everyone listening is also going to die. And what I want to talk about in this episode is the fears that you might have around death and the irrational fears that you have around death, and how even when we talk about life, most people don't live. They actually exist as a shell of a life, and they're not truly even living. Now, that being said, I want to do the best that I can to cogently, put this together and create some meaningful thought for you. That being said, one of the biggest illusions and limitations of humans is even thinking of death as death. I mean, right, as kids, I don't know about you, but, as a little kid, I was taught that, you're going to live and then you're going to die, and old people die, and your grandma and grandpa, grandpa just died, etc. I'm just being metaphorical there and analogous, not metaphorical, but analogous. And you've heard that before, but what thoughts, what images did you conjure up as a small kid about what death is and how does that apply to you? Now, if you've listened for any amount of time, you know that I often talk about my brother-in-law, Don Javier, the shaman and sorcerer. And I want to go back many years ago. I have worked with him, I guess, 25 years now. When I say I guess, I'm thinking it's 25 years this year. And he does Dreamtime work. That's where the most of his work is done, in Dreamtime, in the ethers between dimensions. And when he started formally, air quote, working with me, the very first night, I had this dream. And I remember very vividly. And as a matter of fact, I took notes on it. I even found them recently. But in the dream, we were living during Roman times. And he had this big spear, and he stabbed me. And in that dream, air quote, I died. And then what he did, I remember the next part of the dream where it's as if that never happened. And he opens up some curtains and we're standing there. And here's the point I want to share, and here's what he said. He said before, see, death is an illusion. Now that's what I want you to take away. The first thought is that death is an illusion. Your death, whenever it should happen, is an illusion. And we'll talk more about what that means as we go through this episode. I know I've shared before, and I shared in another episode about Albert Einstein's law of the conservation of energy and a law of the conservation of matter. and which is physics. And basically that means that you cannot destroy energy and matter. They simply change form. meaning, something can go from energy to matter and then back to energy. Well, you being physics and you being electrons and neutrons and protons, you cannot die. See, there's no such thing as death. What I want to share with you in a thought is, how about this? And I'll dig into it a little more, but there's no such thing as death. There is only life. And there's only life that exists in different frequencies and different forms. As I said, I want to do my best to create some cogent thought in this episode. And there's such grandiose concepts. I'm kind of like, well, how do I do that? So I'll just keep talking and throw out some ideas. But a thought is this. If somebody said to you, what are you? And you've had variations of people saying, who are you and stuff like that in your past. But if somebody said, what are you? Would you ever actually just stop and think and say, you know what? I'm an energetic being that air quote lives and I'm alive now and then I die. But we never say that. We simply say, you know what? I'm Joe Smith and I'm Jane Doe and I'm Puerto Rican, and all these identities that people hold, all this ego. All these ways that people, use to define themselves. And I want to share a little, food for thought here. If you're caught in those egos and identities of being whatever it is whatever identity, that's all ego, meaning Puerto Rican or this nationality or that religion or whatever it might be, that is all ego. And if you're defining yourself by that ego, guess what? You don't know yourself. I'll say it again. If you're defining yourself by a human definition, you don't know yourself. Don Javier and I were once talking. Well, we talk a lot. I see him all the time. We talk all the time. And he said something to me that I was really like, wow, that's an interesting way to look at it, or a powerful way, not interesting, but a powerful way to look at it. He said, a lot of people talk about past lives, and he goes, there's no such thing as a past life, because like I talked about earlier, Einstein, the law of the conservation of energy and matter, life is continuity. You literally, going back to what he said, you don't talk about past lives. You talk about different lives, because you're only living one life in your entire existence. That life is you, because you are life, yet you're living it in different incarnations, different frequencies, different forms, different vibrations. And there's a lot further that I could go here that I'm not, because I don't want to, blow some sockets in people. But you're living throughout whatever your concept is of totality and infiniteness. And think about all of the ways that which we can't even comprehend that as humans, all the ways that you can show up in that infiniteness. And what's interesting is right now I'm sitting in my den. I'm in my home in Sedona, Arizona. There's a picture on Chromecast, and it's of the night skies here are crazy gorgeous. It's a dark sky community. And what that means is like, even at my house, you're not allowed to have, like lights on your back deck and stuff like that. They all have to point to the ground. Why? Because the sky and the TV here picture in the background is reminding me, there's a picture of the Milky Way galaxy on just a screensaver on my big screen TV. And many times in Sedona, when you walk outside on a clear night, it looks like that. It just looks like the entire sky is diamonds. But most of us, the reason I started that loop, meaning conversational loop or thought loop, is that we have such limited ideas about who we are as beings. And most of us live little bitty imprisoned lives by that ideal. So, in the West, and where I was going here is that in the West, many of us are taught to think of the word dead as, and I'm going to use this word colloquially, but a bad word. it has a negative connotation. I mean, no one ever says when they're young, whoa, that death thing, I can't wait to get to that. I mean, that seems like a great roller coaster. I want to ride that ride. Many people are, even if they're not afraid of it, it's something that they never think about. And it's something so far in the back of their mind, and, and obviously something that a lot of people think, well, that won't happen to me because it's not in my present future. And as a matter of fact, even if it's not in your present future, as long as death is not touching you in some way, meaning a friend, a family member, or in some way death is not around you, you probably don't even think about it. You know, I'm just going to go to a couple of places here in different thoughts. I remember many years ago, I had a client and she said, I'm really sad. And I said, what are you sad about? And she said, my mother died. And by the way, and it might sound a little callous to people, but when people say somebody died, I never say I'm sorry. And the reason why is, why would I be sorry for something that's a natural progression? I mean, when you incarnated on the planet, that's part of the agreement. That's like, for example, you go into college and you're graduating, and I'm like, I'm sorry you graduated from college. No, it's a liberation out of the body. But anyway, you know, we have such this negative, we're taught in the West this negative connotation. But this lady was like, my mother died and I'm so sad. And I said, when did your mother die? And she goes, 10 years ago. And I'm like, your mom, and I was, not being judgmental, but I was asking for clarity. I'm like, your mom died 10 years ago and you're sad about it today? And she was in this funk about it. And she's like, yeah, I'm so sad my mother died. And she was, my definitions, my interpretations, wasting her life being sad about her mother not being on the planet when it's part of her mother's contract. And she's headed the same way herself. And I see that so often in people, especially in the West, is they're sad when somebody dies. And to me, it's a liberation out of the body. You know, I see so many people mourning the death of someone else, and the whole while they're mourning, they're giving up their own life. And you know what? I'll finish this podcast, this episode. I want to share a parable with you in a bit that I think will change your interpretations about life and death and after this life. And hopefully it'll maybe create a little more perspective for you to give you a little more freedom in your thinking and a little more freedom in your life. You know, Don Javier has often said to me when I say things to him and we're talking, and there's so many things I could say here in this episode that I've said in others. But I remember he was talking to a couple of us that worked with him one time. And he said, you know what? You're already dead. And I think he was saying that because some people were getting into some fear. And he's like, what's the point of fear? He goes, the worst thing that can happen to you is you can die. And that's a good thing too. And you're already dead. And I've thought about that over the years, and I haven't pondered it a lot, but I mean, it just made sense in that moment, is that, and this is a whole different episode, is that you are dead right now to most of your higher function. Most of you listening, even though I know that you're spiritually aware and you're opening and you're in tune, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be listening to my podcast, there's a large part of you that's dead. So the question that I have is about living. Why not live? Now, when I mean live, what I mean by that is really, really living. Have you ever even contemplated the phrase, when people say, well, live your life? You ever really thought about and just stopped and like, what does that mean to live my life? What does that mean to you? Because doing what I've done for a lot of years, and I guess just working with a shaman and being observant about this, is, truth be told, in my observation, most people don't live. And I'm going to use the word air quote live. Most people don't live. Most people exist. And maybe that applies to you. I don't know. But see, living is being in joy every day. Living is being in peace every day. Living is being in growth and exploration, not expiration, sorry, exploration. Living is literally living, yet most of us, we literally exist. Job in, job out, day in, day out, husband in, wife in, kids in, day out. And we're literally, many of us, and I've been there many years ago, is that we're marking time until we die. And you've heard me mention it before, is that all any of us have, all you have is right now. And whatever that means to you. That's it. Tomorrow doesn't exist, and I'll get to that in a minute. It doesn't exist. Tomorrow doesn't exist, and yesterday didn't exist. All you have is right now. But even when people think they're living now, many people are living in fear and in their negative 3D emotions. What I've observed, and of course there are socioeconomics in the world that affect the way people live in different parts of the world. So I'm only talking right now from the perspective of the Western world and the United States and countries that are industrialized, etc. But most people live as a shell of what they could be. I mean, they live the identity and the bag of skin, meaning the body and everything else, but they're not living. They're simply existing. And then most of that life that they're living in fear. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute, but I want to go somewhere else here for a second. Many people have written in and they've said, "Where's Jim?" And by the way, those of you that have written in, I appreciate it. It's kind of like, where's Waldo? I mean, what happened to Jim? He was doing podcasts. I don't know where you are in your sequence of listening. And around last November, I kind of just dropped off the radar. And this is late January. And people wrote in and they said, "Where's Jim?" Well, where I was is on November the 17th, I had a hemorrhagic stroke. And when it comes to strokes, there are two kinds. I don't know the names of both. One's some kind of stroke. The others are hemorrhagic strokes. The other strokes are worse. Hemorrhagic strokes, I also had, there's 4 categories, I believe, 4 stages. I had the first stage. And I want to tell you that if there are 4 stages of the hemorrhagic, and that's not the worst stroke, that flipped my world and my life physically upside down. As a matter of fact, the night I had the stroke, I don't remember a lot of it. I don't remember most of it. I don't remember really anything until I woke up in the hospital, the ICU, 2 hours away in Phoenix, where they airlifted me to. But I don't remember things that happened. And actually, I don't remember what I started in the story, but I'm sure I'll come back to it. But I had the stroke. I don't remember anything from when I had it. And then 2 days later, I woke up in the ICU. And then I was in the hospital for 2 more days, 2.5 days after that. So 4.5 days. So, what I was saying was, if I had like the least of everything you can have and it flipped my life upside down, holy cow. Because what I was going to say here is the night that I had the stroke, I do remember this in the emergency room. And I won't go into it in this episode, but it was serendipitous. And it was, great. It was a great fortune for me, the way everything happened. And I'm glad everything happened because I've learned tons of lessons. And I wouldn't be creating this episode if that had not happened, and many other things that I want to do. Everything that happens to us is a blessing, even that stroke. And I forgot again what I was going to say, but that's okay. And I'm being vulnerable. And I'm not being vulnerable because it doesn't matter. I'm just sharing with you guys. But I was just, a part of having a stroke also, most of my memory is back. But what I was going to say is the night that I had the stroke, I couldn't talk. And I remember that I couldn't talk. And I remember being in the ER and my sister was there, married to Don Javier, the shaman, and he was there. And I could not talk. I couldn't vocalize. And I remember being almost mute. And the very next day, I don't remember anything, and I was airlifted to Phoenix. And I'll get to a little more of that in a moment. But now, for the most part, I'm back to air quote normal. I don't have any whatsoever long-term effect, any kind of paralysis, any really anything long term that's debilitating other than I'm healing. And it knocked the wind out of my sails. And I wasn't going to do the podcast till I started. I didn't feel bad, but I wanted to heal. And it took me about a month also, after the hospital, to really start gathering some energy and everything else. And now I'm walking every day and getting back in the swing of life and all that kind of good stuff. But holy cow, did that knock the wind out of me. And, it's interesting is my brother-in-law, the shaman, I mean, he started helping me immediately, energetically. And he was actually part of the story, which I won't get into right now in this episode. But within about a day, I had my full speech back. Literally within about a day, I could talk. And I could not talk the very hours after it happened. And I was even airlifted from Sedona, where I live, to Phoenix, and I don't even remember the helicopter ride. I'm not even aware, which is part of what I want to share with you in this episode. Wasn't even aware that I was airlifted. Didn't even know it. Don't remember it whatsoever. My first helicopter ride of my life, and I'm sure my insurance hadn't come in yet. I'm sure it cost a fortune, and I don't even remember my first helicopter ride. So anyway, I want to share a tiny bit of that experience with you here in this episode. It was a big aha for me, and I think it will be, even though you've probably heard what I'm going to say and you maybe even thought about it, is that DX for many years has said, when I say DX, I mean Don Javier, has said always that today is a good day to die. And I'm sure you've heard me mention that in the podcast. And I've always air quote understood it and thought I knew what it meant. And when I had the stroke, I was gone. I mean, I was gone. I didn't know that I had the stroke. Meaning, had I actually air quote died, I could have died and I wouldn't have even known that I died. So the huge realization for me about life and death with this stroke is that when I had the stroke, I went down and I knew I was going down. And unfortunately, I texted my sister and she answered, which she never answers, and whole big story behind it. But here's what I want to share with you. I was unaware for 3 days. Unaware. And here's the thing. I could have been the same as dead, and my 3D, meaning Jim doing this podcast now, would never know it. So what I'm sharing with you is that when you kick the bucket, whatever you call it, rolling, I think people call it rolling a pair of sevens, and you kick the bucket or you air quote die, you're not going to know it. You're not going to know it, and that I promise you. Now, completely off topic, for those of you that are metaphysical, is the reason that I knew something. Okay, I knew I was somewhere, and I'm going to use air quote for somewhere. I knew I was somewhere the whole time. And because when I woke up in the hospital, I knew what had happened to me, though no one had told me. Now, what I don't know is that I picked that up subconsciously and recorded all and automatically woke up with the knowing, or did I literally just actually process that in consciousness? I knew when I was out for 3 days, I knew that I was somewhere, and I couldn't tell you where I was. It was kind of like, if I just want to use these words, in between dimensions. I knew that I was somewhere, but I didn't know where I was. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, so where was I? I literally was, off having a stroke and then healing for a couple of months, and now I'm back. I do want to point out something also. 2020 was a banner year for me. It was for the entire planet, but it was a banner year for me in that I don't know how long you've been listening or what you've heard, but I also had what they call congestive heart failure last February. And I ended up in the hospital again. First time in my life ever in a hospital. And I'm sharing this off topic so you know the power of healing. Now, congestive heart failure is known as it's a lifetime condition. And I was told by my cardiologist and all this because when I went to the hospital, I was at 30% heart function. And I was told you're going to have heart failure the rest of your life, blah, 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 all these kind of things. And I remember saying, no, I'm not. I am not. I'm not going to live my life as a sick person. I refuse to live that way. And when I was in the hospital this time, they also did an echocardiogram and checked out my heart and all that kind of stuff. And I had neurologist and cardiologist and all of that. And my cardiologist said to me, he said, you said that you were diagnosed with congestive heart failure. And I said, yes, in February. It's November now, however many months that is, yes. And he goes, no. He goes, your echocardiogram, you're at 71, or it's like, well, I know 70. You're at 70% heart function. He goes, your heart is functioning better than most people's hearts. And after the heart failure happened, Don Javier put me on high doses of magnesium, which do your own research on that. I mentioned it before, but it cleans out the heart. And I mean, my heart's functioning beautifully this day and age. And so I share that with you because when anybody gives you any kind of diagnosis, it's not true until you own it. So even when I was just in the hospital, and I told you when I started this episode, I'm going to jump around a little bit. So hopefully I'm giving you a lot of food for thought, and we'll go back to the topic, life and death. But you know what? I refuse to own the things the doctors even said to me about a stroke and the level of stroke that I have. One more thing, off topic. One of the things with a stroke is that it obviously affects your brain. And it affected my memory really badly for about a month. I mean, my long-term memory was great. Some of my short-term memory I lost, but once I would remember something, then it was locked back in the short-term memory. So if I'm telling you a story here on this episode, the podcast or episodes, and I forget where I'm going, I'll just even tell you because I don't want to start the episodes again. I'll just tell you, hey, I forgot. I'll come back to it. So for right now, at least, while I'm still healing, I get a hall pass. Okay, let's get back to the episode. Okay, I've got some questions for you. And they're life and death questions. So just ponder these as I share them with you, okay? And you may want to write them down, but just, even beyond this episode, write them down, whatever, but think about them. And the first question is this. In what ways can I have a healthy contemplation about my death? So think about that. In what ways can you have a healthy contemplation about your death? And I call it actually, I don't use the word death, I use the word transition because you just transition off the planet. And I use the word healthy also because contemplate it. I mean, how can you make it as healthy as possible when it does happen for you? I'm not suggesting you invite death. I mean, I'm not inviting it. I got things I want to do on the planet. Like Don Javier told me, and even one of my good friends, after having heart failure and a stroke and I'm still here, I have work to do on this planet. Okay, that's the first question. The second one is this. If I wrote and I lived, and I use the word air quote lived, meaning you actually lived, if I wrote and lived my headstone, and it didn't say what I wanted it to say, but it said how I truly lived my life, what would it say about me? Now, would it say, here lies Bob. He physically died this week, but he really died 15 years ago? Or would it say, here lies Susan. She never lived. She lived an entire lifetime afraid of anything and everything around her and afraid of her own shadow. Or would it say, you know what? Here's, Amy. And Amy lived an amazing, joyful, prosperous, abundant, happy life. What would your tombstone say if you literally left the planet today, Not what you want it to say, but what would it say about how you have lived your life? Also, what can you learn from the inevitable death transition that you'll have at some point? There's a phrase that I was taught many years ago, and I find it to be very powerful. And that phrase is that death is your greatest advisor. And to demonstrate that, how many, little memes and everything else, I don't know, how long is a meme? I don't know. Is a meme just, a couple of words? So maybe it's not a meme. But it's a little passages you see on Facebook and everything else where people say like the 5 things that people regret when they're dying. But that's an advisor. That's what I mean by the great advisor. The next question is why? Why do I choose to hold all these fears in life when they pale in comparison to death? Because I have to die at some point anyway. And the question is, why do I choose to hold all these fears in life when they pale in comparison to death and I have to die at some time anyway? Ponder that. And I'm asking you, what benefit do you get from holding all these fears? And I'm going to tell you right now, and you've heard it in other episodes, many of you hold ridiculous fears like, oh my God, I'm in my 40s. I'm making this up, but I'm in my 40s and my mother is not going to approve of me. Or what are my parents going to say? Or what are their neighbors going to say? That is ridiculous thinking. And if you're being honest, how many of you get into that nonsense? I told you a bit ago that I want to share a parable with you. And I have to read it, but I'm going to read it to you here. So turn up your speakers or pay attention to this parable as I share it with you. So in a mother's womb, there were 2 babies. And one asked the other, "Do you believe in life after death?" And the other replied, "Why, of course. There has to be something after delivery. I mean, maybe we're here to prepare ourselves for what we will be later." And the first baby in the womb said, "Nonsense. There's no life after delivery. What kind of life would that be?" And the second said, "I don't know, but there will be more light than here. Maybe we'll walk with our legs and maybe we'll eat with our mouths. Maybe we will have other senses that we can't understand now." And the first replied, "That's absurd. Walking is impossible. And eating with our mouths? Ridiculous. The umbilical cord supplies nutrition and everything we need. But the umbilical cord is so short, life after delivery is to be logically excluded." And the second insisted, "Well, I think there is something, and maybe it's different than it is here. Maybe we won't need this physical cord anymore." And the first replied, "Nonsense. And moreover, if there is life, then why has no one ever come back from delivery? Delivery is the end. And in the after delivery, there's nothing but darkness and silence and oblivion. It takes us nowhere." And the other baby said, "Well, I don't know, but certainly we will meet Mother and she will take care of us." And the first replied, "Mother? You actually believe in Mother? That's laughable. If Mother exists, then where is she now?" And the second said, "She's all around us. We're surrounded by her. We are of her. It is her that we live with. Without her, this world would not and could not exist." The first baby replied, "Well, I don't see her, and it's only logical that she doesn't exist." To which the second one replied, sometimes when you're in silence and you focus and you really listen, you can perceive her presence and you can hear her loving voice calling down from above. Think about that. Think about that. Okay, so I'm going to let that parable sit with you. And I want to go to a final transformational takeaway question that I have for you in this episode. Before I give you that question and share it with you, if I can ask you a favor, please, and a little reciprocity and a little eining, is if you get value out of the podcast and you enjoy it, please share it. It's so easy for you to listen and get value and then go on about your day. When share the podcast, help other people. Because if you're getting help here, transforming your life, don't you think other people also would get the same kind of help, or in some way they're going to find what they need? So if you're enjoying the episodes, please share. Okay. So the transformational takeaway question is this. If you had 6 months to live, how would you change your life starting now? I'm going to repeat the question. If you had 6 months to live, how would you change your life starting now? I could do what a lot of people say. Well, what if you were to die tomorrow? And people ask that question all the time, and it's a hypothetical because most people never think, well, okay, I'm going to die tomorrow. So the thing is this. When people say, if you were to die tomorrow, how would you be different today? Or what would you do? And you get the stock impulsive answers. Well, spend time with my kids, enjoy my day, smell the flowers, blah, blah, blah. It's an impulsive answer. But if you really only had 6 months, I guarantee you, pretty much, I'll say 99% of you would change how you live. Because guess what? In 6 months, you can actually do change, make change. You can do things differently, to be different, to create different things. And we see many times 6 months is okay, that's workable. I can do that. So your transformational takeaway question is this. If you had 6 months to live, how would you change your life starting now? Okay. That being said, that wraps up this episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me, kind of waddle through it and get through it. Thank you for letting me share my stories. And I'll catch you over on another episode. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this entire podcast. If you're the kind of person who likes to help others, then share this with your friends and family. If you found value, they will too. So please share via your social media channels. Also, if you have questions, I'm here to assist. You can email me questions to support@jimfortin.com, and I may even use your question for a future podcast episode. Also, if you want transformational content like this daily, connect with me on Instagram. My Instagram name is I am Jim Fortin. Finally, I do have a personal request. I believe that we're all here to help others and to grow and evolve ourselves. Together, you and I, let's help more people. If you would please leave a review on iTunes, and a good one, by the way. I'd be grateful, and through your assistance together, we can transform